So if you have any questions, please just let me know. You can chime in over the audio and just interrupt me. If you don't have audio, I'm going to try and keep an eye on the chat. I'm sure Lauren and Kristen can help me with that a little bit in case I miss someone's comment. Okay, so we're going to talk about beekeeping considerations for small acreage beginners. I'm really focusing a lot today on the cost of getting started and the cost that you'll incur to harvest honey. There is a fact sheet, actually a suite of fact sheets that cover this information. So I know everyone can see okay, right? They're seeing the big slide. Okay, great. I know that our websites can be a little bit challenging to navigate. So I'm going to start with a little bit like that. So if you go to OK State Extension, you will see programs and services. If you click on that, you will see all of our programs offered, which is just a really great resource in general. Today, we're focusing on honeybees. So if you click honeybees, it will take you to this website. This website will actually host all of the resources that we're building out to cover this material. So that includes fact sheets. There's one little video up right now. We are working on building an online course. The online course will be hosted on here as well as amongst the suite of other online courses. That course will be $25 to take. It's definitely not a profit generator for OSU Extension. It really just covers the cost of hosting an online course online and having IT people make sure it doesn't crash and all those sorts of things. That course will be a lot more immersive than what I'm talking about today. In that course, I actually have video of me going through a hive inspection. There's video of us using 3 or 4 different kinds of equipment to harvest honey. There's a lot more detail in terms of like pests and that kind of management. So that is really going to be your go-to place for an all-inclusive beekeeping course that is inexpensive and that you can take online. That will, fingers crossed, be done in September. So I'm sure Lauren can share that whenever it's available for those of you that are interested. So the main fact sheet that we're going to be focusing on today is beginning honey beekeeping equipment and associated costs. This information will also be shared with you after the Zoom. And it really is neat because it has an online interactive Excel tool that you can use to calculate your own costs. So I'm going to give examples today. These are prices that I pulled about 2 years ago. So even though this fact sheet is not necessarily old, prices of everything has gone up, right? So just kind of be aware of that. Like as you look at these prices, they may be a little bit higher today. So the first thing I always like to cover when I'm talking about bees is the Apiary Act. So the Apiary Act is really the main law in Oklahoma that kind of governs beekeepers. So it provides the regulations and protections for beekeepers. So yes, there's some regulations, but it's also your protections. So there are laws in place to prohibit county, municipal, consolidated government, or other political subdivisions from restricting the establishment or maintenance of beehives. I know this group is kind of the small acreage group, so you may not have a hive in your actual home in a subdivision. Sometimes people see the word subdivision and think that means like your HOA subdivision, but that is not true. They're talking about government subdivisions in this law. And so if you are a backyard beekeeper, your HOA may have additional restrictions on you that is outside of this act that we're talking about. But this is the small acreage group, so you probably are not going to have beehives in a subdivision in a backyard like I do. So it's still important to be a good neighbor. So even though, you know, it's your right to have bees under this Apiary Act, you still need to be considerate of where you put your hives, be aware of what your neighbors have going on. One thing I caution people, if you do have a neighbor nearby, especially if that neighbor has a pool, bees need water. And so if they don't have an easy source of water nearby, they will use your neighbor's pool. The source of water can be easy. My bees have a dog bowl with one of those like big 5-gallon jug things that goes on top of it with some pieces of floating wood. That is what they drink out of. It's right in front of the hive. They'll drink out of that before they go to my neighbor's pool. So it doesn't have to be anything elaborate. But having a water source near your bees is really important because they will go to your neighbors and find a water source. Registration. So registration is voluntary in the state of Oklahoma. So then why would you want to register? Well, there's a few protections that registration actually gives you. So there's 3 types of registration. The easiest one is the sensitivity registration. That is $0 to enroll. Basically what that does is it puts you on the sensitivity map. And so that means if, I live in Stillwater, if we have a huge mosquito problem and the city of Stillwater decides to spray mosquito fog all over my neighborhood because I'm registered, they should avoid around my house. I also feel that it gives you some protection that if the city does spray something, if you're at least registered, you have something to point to. If you're not registered, it's really hard to start saying things like, you sprayed and now my bees are dead and. So having that sensitivity registration is important. There's also the voluntary beekeeper registration, which is what I have. It's $10. And then there's the migratory beekeeper registration, which is not really likely to be someone in this group. Migratory beekeeping, that is when you're doing beekeeping for pollinator services. And so that means that you're going to have bees that are crossing state lines. So like if you were taking bees from Oklahoma to California to pollinate the almond groves, you would need the migratory beekeeping license, which is $100. So like I said, it puts you on the sensitivity map. And then also sometimes farmers markets will require that you be registered. I have a slide at the end. Basically, each farmers market has its own rules. And so that sometimes can be a rule. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the FSA. Are you guys familiar with the FSA? You can do a thumbs up. Okay, so the FSA is the Farm Service Agency, and you go to your FSA office and you register for a farm number, and then you may or may not qualify for different programs that they have. Bees are livestock, and so this means that they have the same benefits as other livestock species. So they are covered under the ELAP, which is the Emergency Assistance for Livestock, Honeybees, and Farm-Raised Fish. And I'm actually working on a fact sheet on this information right now. Basically, what has to happen is they have to declare that an emergency has happened in your county, so in your area. And those events include a colony collapse disorder, an earthquake, a winter storm, wind, hurricane, drought. So if you live in an area that has been declared a drought area by the FSA, you actually can qualify for assistance in feeding your bees. So they will pay, I don't have this on the slide because we just figured it out this afternoon, but they will pay 60% of your feed costs if you're in a drought and it has been declared a drought area. They will also pay for losses. So they define 2 different things. They define a colony and they define a beehive. And so a colony is the bees and a beehive is the bees plus like the box they live in. And so if a tornado comes and wipes out your beehive, there's actually been some claims of fire lately. So if a fire comes through and burns all your bees up, under ELAP, you can actually get some of that money back. And it just depends on each year. There's a dollar value that's declared. It's the market value. It's like 75% of that. If you are a limited resource veteran beginning farmer, they'll actually pay 90% of the declared market value. So it is a program. I will say that if you don't already have a relationship with the FSA because of other parts to your acreage that you have, if I only have 2 beehives, and so if my beehives were to blow over and be destroyed tomorrow, I wouldn't want to deal with the FSA, right? And so it just kind of depends on your situation. This program really makes a lot of sense if you have a lot of beehives. It also makes sense if you have other parts of an operation and you already have a relationship with the FSA to make sure that you have your beehives declared so that if something happens, you can participate in these programs. Does that make sense to everyone? Any questions? Okay, we're gonna get to the more fun part now. Well, fun may be relative because there's prices involved, so that kind of takes out some of the fun. So finding your equipment. Really, there's no right or wrong way to do this. So they have equipment at Atwoods. They have equipment at Tractor Supply. There's equipment on Amazon. There's equipment from beekeeping suppliers. There's people that are way more crafty than I am, and they build all of their equipment. So it really, shopping is fun, but spending is stressful. Yes. So it really kind of depends on your personal aptitude and your budget. I will say that there were some really strange things that happened last year where traditionally buying frames, let's say frames from the big beekeeping organizations that were unassembled, those traditionally were cheaper. Last year, Atwoods had some great sales on beekeeping equipment, and Atwoods was actually cheaper. And so I would encourage you all to kind of keep an eye on the prices, and you may be surprised at who is actually the low-cost provider. For me, it's always a, oh shoot, I need this equipment, so I'm running to Atwoods. I'm really bad about storing equipment and having equipment ready for the next stage of my beekeeping adventure. Oh, one thing to make sure of is that your beekeeping equipment is compatible. So most equipment, most of the boxes are Langstroth hives, and those typically are 10 frames. They do make boxes that are 5 frames. So if you're buying additional boxes, make sure you're buying the same size ones. It should be pretty clear, like when you're reading, but like if you're on Amazon sometimes, like make sure that you're reading the details and you're buying the right size equipment. Okay, so setting up your hive. Most hives come untreated and they're made of pine wood, and this pine wood can like really easily warp. And so we really encourage everyone to paint their hives. What you want to do is you want to use a paint that has a low VOC. If you go to Lowe's or any other store, paint store, and you ask for this, they'll know what you're talking about. It's okay if you don't know, because the first time I went, I said, I need low VOC, don't really know what that means. It's also labeled on the paint can. And so when you look for an outdoor paint, it'll say low VOC on it. It's just the volatile organic compound. It's just like the toxicity of the paint. And you want to make sure to use an outdoor paint, and this will help extend the life of it. And you also want to use light colors. A lot of people will just paint all their hives white and slap a number on the side. You will want a number or a color or some other identifying feature of the hive so that you can keep track of it in your records. Because when you start doing things like requeening, or if you are worried that a hive doesn't have enough food in it or something like that, you want to make sure that you're saying, okay, hive number 2, I put a new queen on there on this date, and you start doing your bee math. If they're all just white boxes and they don't have numbers, that can be hard. My hives are different colors. I actually read a little bit about that, and it helps with drift. And so drift is when a bee is coming home, and if your hives are close to each other, it goes into the wrong house. That's a problem because the bees will attack an invader. And so you end up with some dead bees, or you end up with one hive that has all of the bees and the other hive is like empty. That's an extreme case, but it can happen. And so having different colored hives helps the bees because they can see some variation of color. It helps them realize like, okay, this is my house, and go into the right house. Okay, choosing a location. You want a location that is well drained with good airflow. Northern windbreak is ideal. That windbreak could be hay bales. So like if you don't have an area that has a natural windbreak, you can put hay bales out there. If you're not near water, you need to provide the water. People may recommend using mulch or rock underneath the hive so you don't have to mow. I did weed barrier and mulch. I wish I would have put like 5 layers of weed barrier or rock and weed barrier. Like I wish I would have done something else because grass is growing up through my mulch and I can't mow it because there's mulch. And so it becomes an issue for me and I have to get out there and pull grass, which no one wants to do, or pull weeds, and there's bees, right? So be a little bit mindful. Some people will put on a bee suit and mow around their hives. Some people just mow around their hives if they have calm hives. You can't always guarantee that the temperament of your bees will last forever. Bees requeen. Bees get angry if they maybe don't have a queen. Bees get angry if they don't have enough food. There's lots of reasons why, even if your bees are really nice right now, they may not be nice next year. And so when you're thinking about where you put your beehive and when you're thinking about what to put underneath them, you really have to think long term in terms of how you're going to maintain that area. And then leave space between your hives to prevent the drifting. Elevate your hive. Hives need to be elevated off the ground. This can be as simple as cinder blocks or wooden legs. Remember, wooden legs can rot. You have to make sure those hives are level because the frames dangle in the hive box. And so if it's tilted, they'll all dangle to one side and crash into each other. And so like when I built my hives out, I actually took a level and made sure it was level so that all the comb would be hanging straight down. Okay, sorry, I hit the thing. Okay, given the wind in Oklahoma, consider tying down your hives or placing a brick or rock on top. I have the ratchet straps on my hives. I'm also the advisor for the OSU Beekeeping Club. College students don't like to slow down and like remove ratchet straps and deal with those sorts of things. And so they just had put big rocks on top of the hives. Well, a family of raccoons came in and picked up the rocks and took off the lids and ate all the bees and all the honey. So I like the idea of ratchet straps for many reasons. People that live in bear country, sometimes what they'll do is they'll actually ratchet strap the hive together and ratchet strap the hive down. So be mindful of where you live and what kind of critters may visit your hives when you're determining the best way to kind of keep the hive together. Okay. This is my personal setup. This is a backyard. This is the side of my house. I live in town and I have 2 hives. You notice the one on the right has 2 boxes. So this deeper box is called a brood box. Hives have metal buckles that keep, oh, that's nice. Okay, so Tim in the comments is mentioning that there's some types of hives that have a buckle that you can buckle down, which is nice. So I have the ratchet strap situation on mine. If you notice on the blue box, I have 2 deeps. It is recommended to, in most of Oklahoma, if you're in the very southernmost part, you can probably get away with 1 deep. I have 2 on this hive. This is an older, more established hive. They just got that second box, so they have a feeder attached. This is their home. So the first box and the second box, that is their house. I do not take honey from those 2 boxes. Notice I have a feeder on. You will never have a feeder on if you have a honey super. So the honey super, they're a smaller box, they're about half this height, and you put them on, and that is what you're harvesting from when you harvest your honey. You don't want to have a feeder on when you have a honey super because it makes what people will call funny honey. So honey made with sugar water, not from nectar. People say they can tell a difference. And so it's recommended to not feed your hives when you have a honey super on for human consumption. Why are the honey supers smaller? As an economist, when I pencil it out, I wish I was strong enough to pick up a deep box full of honey because a deep box makes a lot more sense. You save a lot of money on equipment, but it is so heavy with honey. With bees and other things, these boxes are still about 60 pounds. They need to have 60 pounds of honey going into winter. I have one student who's very particular, and he actually gets out there with a scale and weighs all the honey in each of the hives and makes sure they have 60 pounds. Me, I just kind of know how much a typical frame weighs and count and guess is that close to 60 and kind of move on. So there's a lot of different ways to beekeep. If you ask people what they do, you're going to get a lot of different answers. And so just be prepared for that. Some people are nicer than others when it comes to sharing information about how they do things. You can always call me or email me if you have questions. If I don't know the answer, I have colleagues across the country that will probably have the answer for you. So don't get discouraged if someone online is mean to you. It happens. The box on the left has one deep. This is a brand new, this was actually a swarm that was caught. Hang on, I'm letting some people into the talk. Okay. So this was actually a swarm I caught. So they're, again, a brand new swarm. So they're being fed so they can draw out the comb. When I say draw out the comb, I'll show some pictures of equipment here in a second. That is just putting wax on the frames in that famous hexagon shape, and that is where they store things. And by things, I mean they store honey, they store pollen, and baby bees. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, or we'll keep going. This is my hives. These are my hives later in the summer. And so what you see here is I've added the honey super. So the blue hive has one honey super. The pink hive did really well, and they have 2 honey supers. These little decorative bowl things, my mom made them to help the bees get water. The problem is the water evaporates way too fast. So as cute as they are and as like aesthetically pleasing, they now have a giant dog bowl sitting out there because trying to refill those little things was just too much work. Okay, so feeding your hive. Most beekeepers will feed their bees during certain times of the year. Again, they're not feeding their bees when they have a honey super on. This is a good point to make. Typically in your first year, you do not get honey for human consumption. The very first year, your bees are building out their house. So those 2 boxes that they live in, they are storing honey for their consumption over the winter. It is very, very unlikely that you will have enough resources for your bees to build out a honey super for you to collect from. So just keep that in mind. So most people heavily feed their bees when they're brand new. So whether you get a nuke or a package, you're going to be feeding those bees so they can draw out the comb and have honey to store. It takes a lot of resources to draw out comb. And so comb becomes a really valuable thing in your beekeeping production. So in the spring, people typically feed the 1-to-1 sugar to water ratio. This encourages comb building and brood rearing. Brood is baby bees. Fall, people typically do 2-to-1 sugar to water ratio to help give them some extra stores for winter. Again, you're only feeding after you have taken off your honey supers and only if your bees just don't have enough resources. This last spring, a lot of people lost bees due to starvation. And the main issue was we had a really warm spring that would have one warm day and then freeze the next. And so the flowers and other things that the bees get resources from were not growing. And so bees were like, wow, it's warm outside. It's 80 something degrees. They'd leave the hive, expend a lot of energy, and then there would be nothing for them to bring back. And so they were expending a lot of energy and then they weren't bringing anything back to feed themselves with. And so even if you went into winter with 60 pounds of honey, for a lot of hives, that simply wasn't enough. And so that's why it's really important in the spring to make sure that you're monitoring how much feed your bees actually have in terms of capped honey. Because if we have a lot of false springs like we did this year, there were a lot of bees that starved because they ran out of food to eat. Okay. Like I said, they'll feed a new hive until nectar flow begins. So far, let's take a little inventory. We've bought a brood box with frames, a vented inner cover, a telescoping outer cover, a bottom board, and an entrance reducer. There are some pretty good packages that you can buy. That's about $120. The hive stand, the example I'm giving is just 4 concrete blocks. That's about $7. A plywood sheet for the base, that's 15. Ratchet straps is 14. So before we even have started with bees and other equipment, we've already spent about $156. And I expect that to be a little bit higher with today's prices. So here's some of the equipment I was discussing. This to the left here is an external feeder. There's some controversy. Basically, there's controversy about every piece of equipment in beekeeping. It's just the way it is. External feeders, for some people, it encourages robbing. Robbing is when bees from other hives come to your hive to steal resources. My bees live behind a fence, and there's not very many other beekeepers around. And so I like the external feeders because I can see how much they're eating. Refilling the feeders is easy because they're in my backyard. And so I can just walk out there and feed them. If you have an internal feeder, that requires you to open up the hive. And so you may want to put on your bee suit to do that. I just want to make sure that everyone's muted. Okay. I'm just hearing some feedback and background noises. So just make sure that you are muted on the Zoom. Okay, so on the left, we have the external feeder. In the middle, we have the internal feeder. This internal feeder actually replaces one of the frames. And so you can see on the right hand, this is a box that has the internal feeder in it. So I did a split a few weeks ago, and so I actually have an internal feeder in that hive right now because I know they need a lot of feed to build out a whole box. And so this feeder actually holds, it's like 6 cups of sugar water. And so it holds a lot more than this little mason jar. And so I'm having to refill it a lot less with these bees that are consuming a lot of feed. I don't know why it is confusing when you look at it and people don't like to explain, but the answer is take out a frame and put in the feeder. It will not fit in the box with all of the other frames in a 10 frame box. If you have older equipment, you may even have to take out 2 frames, because if your equipment's warped at all, it's just not going to fit. This is a bee brush on the top. It is a less needed piece of equipment. I have one. My husband's kind of gotten into beekeeping with me. It keeps him occupied because he like brushes bees out of the way, and I don't know, he talks to them and does his own thing. So that's his bee brush. It is helpful if you're harvesting honey to kind of brush the bees off the capped honey, because there might be 1 or 2 bees or maybe 5 bees on that frame. And so that's where the brush is in handy. The hive tool is a must-have piece of equipment. There's a couple different kinds. This one doesn't have a hook. There's another kind that does have a hook. You should always have your hive tool on you. That's how you get the top off. That's how you pull frames out. A hive beetle trap. So this is a little piece of plastic. It's like a little reservoir, and it sits in between the frames. And you put a little bit of oil in this reservoir, and the hive beetles fall into it, but bees cannot. Hive beetles are a little brown beetle. They're circular. You will typically see them in your hive. If you see just a couple, it's not a big deal. If you see a ton, your hive is probably having other issues. The way an entomologist explained it to me is that the hive beetles are kind of the puppy dogs of the bee world. Bees, for whatever reason, will feed hive beetles. The hive beetles do nothing. They just sit in the hive, they beg for food, the bees think they're cute, and they feed them, is what an entomologist explained to me. But again, anything that's eating honey that's not you or your bees is kind of a nuisance. So they fall into the pest category. This is a smoker. I do recommend spending a little bit of money on a smoker. So don't get the cheapest smoker, because the cheapest smoker is going to not last very long. It's going to be made of very flimsy metal. It's going to get hot. Some beekeepers are of the opinion that you get a smoker and you take it out with you to the beehives every single hive check, and you just have it ready to go in case you need it. I only have 2 hives. I know their personalities pretty well. I typically don't use a smoker. My bees are pretty gentle. I'll show some pictures of when I ended up with some I never got them tested, but they were either very aggressive or Africanized. And in that scenario, I did need to use some smoke. There are a lot of people that will just use the smoke when they're harvesting honey. Again, there's no wrong way. You don't get bonus points for using smoke. You don't get bonus points for not using smoke. So it's really a personal preference. I have heard many people say that if you do use smoke, it's oftentimes harder to find the queen because she will dive down deeper into the box. You don't always have to find the queen. So that is another thing that new beekeepers tend to freak out about. I am not great at spotting queens. My husband is very, very good. If you see eggs and you see larvae and you see capped brood, you really don't need to see your queen. I probably see my queen every other time, and that's fine. Okay. Extra wax. So if you have brand new frames that you got from wherever, they will say that they're pre-waxed. They'll have 2 globs of wax on it. That is not enough wax. When you have wax on the plastic frames, that encourages the bees to draw a comb. And so what you do is you buy wax. This is not a Yankee Candle. This is not wax from Walmart. This is wax from a beekeeping supplier or another beekeeper. It has to be beeswax. You can either like use a like a crayon, kind of just, if the frames are a little bit warm, you can just rub the wax across the frames. Other people will melt the wax and use a paintbrush and brush it onto the frames. Other people will use frames that are made of wax. These frames are a little bit more expensive. They're also kind of flimsy. If you plan on putting your honey supers into a centrifuge and you have wax frames, they will fall apart. The wax frames for honey consumption, if you've ever been to like a fancy store and they have the cut honey, like the honeycomb in a little box, that was built on a wax frame. And so there's specific reasons why you would use a wax frame. Most people use the plastic frames. They're more durable. You can put them in a centrifuge. You do have to add the extra wax for them to build out the comb faster. I use chicken litter in my smoker. Other people use strips of cloth. Other people use newspaper. Use whatever you want to use. I use chicken shavings. It's cheap. It burns quickly. It has a pretty nice smoke. The smoke doesn't really smell like anything. So that's what I use, but you can use whatever you want. And then there's this thing called a frame grabber. This is like really just like a claw that you use to pick up frames. It is very helpful for people who have bigger hands. So if you have trouble getting your hands into the hive and picking up the frames, these frame grabbers are great. Most of the college guys I work with, my husband, really enjoy the frame grabbers. For me, I have smaller hands. It's not a big deal for me to actually pick up the frames with my hands. So that, again, is a personal preference item. A frame holder. I think these are fantastic. These hang on the outside of your hive. And when you're taking out a frame, you need to make space for you to move the frames to you. When you take out a frame, you hang it on the outside. Again, I work with college students. I've seen a college student put a frame full of brood face down in the grass. Not great. These frame holders help keep the frames going vertical, and they also make sure that like they're not on the grass and they're not getting kicked and like all these different things. So I really like the frame holders. A queen clip. I had a queen for whatever reason. Every time I opened the hive, she jumped out. I don't know why she did that. So I started carrying a queen clip in my pocket for when she jumped out and I had to catch her in the mulch and hold on to her until I was done with the inspection and put her back in the hive. So now I have the habit of just keeping a queen clip in my pocket. A queen excluder. These again are a little bit controversial. A queen excluder goes between your deep box, which is your bee's home, and any box that you're using for human honey consumption. And so what this does is it stops the queen from going up into that box, the honey super, and laying eggs. I've also heard these called wax excluders. and honey excluders, because bees also sometimes do not like going through these excluders. And so a lot of people will recommend, if you have a honey super on and the bees aren't building comb in the honey super, if you have an excluder, remove it. Let them start building comb, and then you can put it back if you want to put it back. Typically, what I've done is just let it go. Because what will usually happen is, even if the queen gets up there and lays some eggs, if the bees need that space for honey, they'll backfill with honey. So as soon as that baby bee hatches, they'll put honey in there and say, no, queen, go down. We're going to put honey in this box. So I've never really had a problem with a queen putting a ton of brood in a honey super. The queen doesn't really like to walk across honey. Bees are weird. I have no explanation for some of these things, but queens don't really like to walk across honey. And so once you have a band of honey at the top of the frame, she's not going to go up there anyways. So use queen excluders if you want. But again, if you're having trouble with bees building comb above the excluder, consider removing it for at least a week or so and let them build up that comb, and then you can replace it. And then I also have a spray bottle listed here. There are some beekeepers that like to mist their bees with a mixture of sugar water to help encourage grooming. Mites are a problem for a lot of beekeepers, and grooming is one way to remove mites. And so some people just spray their bees with sugar water to encourage grooming. If you're installing a package, which we'll talk about here in a second, they will tell you to mist the bees before you install them into the package, or before you install the package into the hive, so they don't fly as much. So there are some reasons to have a spray bottle handy that is like specific for your beehive. Okay, so how do you obtain the bees? We're going to pause real quick, because before you even think about getting your bees, you need to have your deep box, you need to have your suit, you need to have all this other equipment that we just talked about ready to go. I'm going to talk about beekeeping suits for a second. Usually when I do this talk live, I have all this equipment sitting out here in front of me, so I keep wanting to like pick up things to show you guys on Zoom, but I'm in my office at work. Beekeeping suits, they come in a variety of quality and sizes and styles. I started out with a really cheap $30 Amazon suit that was a canvas material. It was fine. I ended up with some really aggressive bees. I got stung through that suit 27 times. I have now upgraded to a mesh suit that offers better protection as well as airflow. I will say this. You do not get bonus points. Your bees do not make more honey if you choose to not wear a suit. For whatever reason, for machismo, for whatever, there is pressure sometimes. You'll see videos where beekeepers are like, I'm not wearing a suit. I don't need gloves. I don't need to wear this protective equipment. That's fine, personal preference. However, when I get stung, I swell up. There are beekeepers that have developed allergies after being stung. Allergies to bee stings. The more you get stung, the higher your chances are of all of a sudden becoming really allergic to bees. And so I choose to protect myself every time I go into the hive. That's my choice. I don't mind taking the 5 minutes to put on my suit and other protective equipment. So if you feel like you want to wear a suit, that's great. If you don't want to, that's fine. But I just hope that we can all respect each other's choices and not pressure people who are uncomfortable into going into a beehive not wearing protective equipment. Okay, so you can purchase a package, you can purchase a nuke, and then you can catch a swarm. That's really the 3 ways that you can get bees. Purchasing a package and purchasing a nuke, you usually make your reservations around January for an April to March pickup. Really, at this time of year, it's too late to start from scratch. So I'm so sorry if you're in this Zoom and you think you're going to like start a beehive tomorrow. People have done it. People catch swarms and it's sometimes fine. We're just getting kind of late into the season. There's probably not nukes available. There's probably not packages available. So it's just getting kind of late. So hopefully you guys are either kind of started or you're planning on starting next year if beekeeping is going to be your thing. Oh, April to May or April to March. It should be May. April to May. You're the only person that's ever caught that mistake. Note to self, I've given this presentation like 50 times. Okay. Yes, and Tim, finding a mentor who will start you with a nuke is super helpful. I'll get into my spiel about what a nuke is here in a minute, but I do really think that a nuke is the best way to get started, especially if it's local, because then you kind of have a built-in mentor. And so when you buy a nuke, you want to make sure that you are in contact with the beekeeper, make sure they're not a scammer. There's so many scammers out there. Like, make sure it's a real person that you talk to on the phone, and like, please don't send money until you've made contact with the person, because there's so many beekeepers that are getting scammed by these horrible people. And then like Tim is kind of mentioning, if you have a nuke, that can also be a built-in mentor. And so when you're panicked because you can't find your queen and you're not sure if she's in there or not sure what's going on, if that person's close enough, they're probably willing to come check out your hive or do a video chat with you or something like that, or talk you through it. And so that's a really great way to get started. Okay, so package bees. These are about $180. It only contains the bees and a queen. So that means you're not getting frames or the wax frames ready to go. Like, comb is not built out. They won't have brood. They won't have honey. They won't have pollen. This is actually how I started, because I waited too late and this was all that was available. I would not recommend it. It can be shipped directly to you. So I actually got my bees from Texas. They were shipped to me in the UPS mail. The mail people were very shocked and called me at like 6 a.m. and I said, "Hi, are you expecting some bees?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "Can you come get them?" And I said, "Sure, you open at 7." And they said, "No, come get them now." So I went and picked up my bees. The pros are they are less expensive. It is easier to handle. If you live in an area that has a lot of brood disease, this is often encouraged because you're not getting brood. And so there's not going to be any kind of disease that is being brought with these bees other than mites. Cons, it can be a slower turnaround time. There are additional feed requirements. And so when I got my package, I was like an A++ student. And I fed. I fed them so much they swarmed. And then I had to catch the swarm. It was a whole ordeal. Okay. So this is me showing you what you do not get with the package. You do not get frames. You do not get honey. You do not get brood. You do not get pollen. You get this plastic box with bees in it. And there will be some dead at the bottom. That's the way it is. My queen came in a queen cage like this. There was a tiny cork in this cage. I had to take the cork out. I had to put a mini marshmallow in, dangle her between the frames. The bees ate the mini marshmallow over the course of a couple of days, released the queen. Even if you get a package, you should be talking to the beekeeper and get instructions on how to release these bees. You should know, my queen is coming in this type of cage. I will need to take out the cork and put the mini marshmallow in. There are different types of cages. There are some that already have a candy cork in there. So you need to talk and ask these questions, and the beekeeper should be willing to explain to you in detail how to release these bees. If they're not willing to do that, personally, I probably wouldn't buy from them, right? Okay. A nuke is more expensive, but you get what you pay for. And so you are actually getting a lot more resources when you buy a nuke. It contains 3 to 5 frames, adult bees, comb with eggs and brood, stored honey and pollen, and usually a reproductive or laying queen. It cannot be shipped, but it can be purchased locally, which is probably a good thing. Because to be honest, I had a lot of trouble with those Texas bees swarming. They really weren't meant for our climate. And so if you buy locally, those bees are more adjusted to your climate and in theory should do better. The cons, it may contain disease spores and pesticide residue. So we talked about how important wax is, and we talked about how much resources it takes to build up wax. Most beekeepers will still rotate out frames after so many years. So if your wax is extremely black, a lot of beekeepers will start rotating out some of those frames for new ones and scrape off that wax, because that wax does store, bees walk across it, right? And so things that are on their feet, whether that's pesticides or other things, get stored into the wax. And so some beekeepers make a habit of kind of switching out their frames for newer ones. We're not talking every year. We're talking like 5 years, right? Okay. This is what it looks like. Some of them look different. Some of them may not be this nice of a tote looking box, but they are 100% contained. Let me go back to this for a second. These are also a little bit easier to install. And so what I mean by install is I mean taking them out of this box and putting them into the brood box where they will live at your house. You actually just pick up these frames and put them in the box with 5 additional new frames to make your 10 frames in a box. And that's the end of it. For the package bees, it's a little bit more difficult because they're just loose, right? So you're spraying them down with the sugar water and you're shaking them out into the hive and putting that box on with the queen inside and walking away. So for a brand new beekeeper that's never handled bees before, shaking out a plastic container full of bees and they fly up and can be a little scary. So I do think the nuke is a little bit less stressful in terms of installing your bees to their new home. Swarms. You can capture a swarm. Usually it's in the late spring, early summer. Usually someone will call it in. So the beekeeping groups on Facebook, oftentimes there'll be announcements. Hey, if you live in Moore, there's a swarm at such and such a street. Swarms are often reported in beekeeping Facebook groups. The pros is it's free other than your time. My own bees swarmed into the tree in front of my house. It took us, a good day to get those bees into a box, get that box moved and all those things. So it's not easy always. The videos you see on Facebook, some of them are pretty cool, right? They find the queen right away. She marches right in and that's the end of it. But my experience with catching swarms with the students is they're typically not that easy. So it does take some time. The con is you can't always find one. And you also don't know the pedigree or the temperament of the captured bees. And so that's the example that I have. We caught a swarm. Swarms are really gentle because they have no resources to protect. So on average, swarms are really gentle. You put them in the box, they start getting resources. In about a month and a half, you see their true personality. And the bees I caught were extremely mean. There's also the potential that you are catching a swarm that absconded. Absconding means they left their hive because of some reason, and that reason could be mites. And so you can catch a swarm that has a really high mite infestation or some other problem. And so you don't know the health of the bees that you're catching in a swarm. In the state of Florida, by law, if you catch a swarm, you have to requeen because they have such a problem with Africanized bees and Africanized hybrids that they basically assume that any swarm that gets caught is partially Africanized. And so they immediately requeen that swarm. And so what I mean by requeening is they'll go in and squash the queen and put a new one in. And so when you do that, because the queen is the only laying that you can have a laying worker. So the queen is the only reproductive bee in the hive. So all of the bees come from her. And so if you have a new queen, in the summer, bees live about 2 months. That means if you put in a new queen in about 2 months, all of the bees in that hive are from her genetics, not from whatever wild one you caught. And so that is why in Florida, they have these rules about requeening because they want to make sure that the genetics of those bees are not the African hybrids. There's so much information to talk about in just a couple of hours and so many tangents to go down. So I'm sorry that this is like drinking from a fire hose and it's a lot to cover, especially if you have no background. Okay, so here's my swarm example. This was in my tree. It was a gigantic swarm. It was pretty big. And so we had this box that we sprayed with lemongrass, and we actually had some drawn frames that we put in there to entice them in. They actually went into this box. Then they decided this box was too small, and they all left the box. So we thought we were done, and then they left the box. So then we tried vacuuming the bees out. This was a student-led project. The student had the vacuum on the wrong setting, and we squashed a bunch of bees, and we squashed the queen. And so then there was a bunch of bees without a queen. And when they don't have a queen, they don't know what to do. And so they were doing weird things like being on the corner of the box and just getting up in the air and flying away and coming back. And so what we ended up doing is putting some brood in a box and pushing a bunch of them in it. And then because there were eggs there and they had figured out they were queenless at that point, they went into the box to try and make a new queen. So that was good. Then I caught another swarm, and this is what a really aggressive hive looks like. So this student touched the lid, and they all came out of the front. If you notice, they're all over his veil. Bees like to go for the eyes because if you were a bear, that'd be the easiest place to sting you. And so his face is covered in bees. That is not normal. So like this kind of behavior is not normal. This on the right, I put out that feeder. That's their feeder. It smells like them. And I put out the feeder and they're just covering the feeder. Anything that came near them, they just went for. And so I had to requeen this hive. And in about 2 months later, I had a much better situation. This hive also had mites. So mites, you can see on the right, that little red dot, that is a mite. The mites carry a disease that results in the deformed wings that you see circled on the left. If you look into your hive and you see deformed wings like this, you have a serious problem with mites, and you definitely need to treat. You probably should have treated long before you saw these deformed wings. Again, this was a swarm that we caught, and so I suspect that they already came with this major infestation. We ended up treating for mites. These are all the mites that fell off the bees. So this is called a mite count board. And you're supposed to be able to count how many mites are in a square and do some calculations and figure out how many mites are in your hive. There's no way we could even begin to count how many mites were on these bees. And so that's kind of when I realized too, our procedure moving forward with the school hives is probably to go ahead and treat every swarm for mites immediately. You can do a test to determine how many mites are in your hive and whether or not you should test or treat. But I think our standard practice moving forward will just be to treat the swarms right away so that we can avoid these problems. I will say the very aggressive bees, as annoying as it was, they made a lot of honey, and it was really nice honey. So I guess that was my treat for dealing with that madness. Okay, here's the sad money part. So we talked about, we have our hive stand, we have all these things, we have the paint. I will say a 1 quart of paint will paint a lot of equipment. I still have my original paint I bought, and I painted 2 deep boxes and 3 supers. And so you can probably with 1 quart of paint all the equipment you need to kit out 2 hives. We have our external feeder, we have our veil and beekeeper suit. And again, those beekeeping suits vary a lot in price. So with all of the different equipment that I've talked about so far, we're at $458. I will say that if you go to this fact sheet, there's an Excel version where you can type in your own prices. And so like if you want to get the more expensive beekeeping suit, you can put in that price. The more hives you have, certain equipment like your beekeeping suit will be spread out over multiple hives, right? You don't need a beekeeping suit for each hive. And so some of these pieces of equipment, your smoker, your hive tool, your bee brush, things like that, is like a one-time thing, whether you have 1 hive or 50 hives. Okay, so within the first year, you probably need an additional deep box. Optional or as needed items, you have your queen excluder, your internal hive feeder. I have internal hive feeder in there because you either have an external or an internal. I have both, you don't need both. And so some of this equipment, depending on which direction you want to go, you may or may not need both things, if that makes sense. Spray bottles, pollen patties, additional frames of wax, oil for hive beetle traps, frame holder, mite strips. There are several different ways that you can treat for mites. Mite strips is one way that is easier in the summer. We can talk about mites some other night, but it is important to really make sure you read the directions if you have to treat for mites. Make sure that you have your honey supers off and you don't put them back on and you're following the directions. Like there's so many weeks that they have to stay off before you can put them back on. Make sure that you're watching the temperature. Oxalic acid is a common treatment for mites, but the temperatures outside have to be low. And so, for example, that hive I had with like all of the mites, that hive had to be treated in the middle of the summer. And so the only product that could handle those temperatures were the mite strips from Apivar. And so it's just really important to read the instructions. Beekeeping, et cetera, is in Oklahoma City. It's a beekeeping shop. They're very helpful. And so if you call them and you need a product and they can talk you through it, and we will have some fact sheets. The entomologist is working on the diseases part and we'll have some more information. Okay. Future purchases that you probably need in the second year are honey supers. And so we're looking at a grand total of about $684 for one hive. If you add additional hives, it's going to be a little bit cheaper because you're not going to be rebuying some of this equipment. Here's an example of what the interactive budget looks like from the fact sheet. And so you can see here, you can easily say how many items you're buying, the estimated costs, it tallies it up for you. So that's fairly nice. Okay, honey and product harvesting. So again, your first year, you're very unlikely to actually have honey to harvest. You need to leave between 40 and 60 pounds for your bees. The rule of thumb that I typically go by is that a deep frame is 6 pounds and a medium frame is 4 pounds. And so I want to leave my bees with 10 frames roughly of honey. And so that's 5 per deep box. Okay, so again, determine, can you collect honey? The answer is yes. Step 2, remove the frames from the hive, smoke and gently shake or brush bees from the frames, via skateboards or repellent or other methods. There's lots of different ways. I did a odd thing, I guess. It worked for me. I only have 2 hives. I had the honey supers on. I have an empty freezer. And so basically I knew how much they had in the deep boxes. So every time they filled and capped, 3 or 4 frames of the honey super, I actually just took those out and put them in the freezer. And then when like the honey flow was over, I thawed out my frames in a tote and removed the honey from the frames and harvested the next day. And so that was an easy way for me. Obviously, if you have 20 hives, you're not going to be, every time you do an inspection, stealing frames and putting them in the freezer. Like that would be ridiculous, right? So find something that works for you. Okay, step 3, you have to uncap the honey. There's electric uncapping knives. They're about $130. Again, I work with students. They got a little crazy with the uncapping electric knife. You do want to try and preserve as much wax as you can, because what you can do the next year, if you store the wax properly and don't get wax worms, which happened to me this year, if you store them properly, you can put those waxed frames with the wax already drawn out back in your hive, and now your bees have less work to do. And so it takes a lot more resources to make wax than it does to make honey. And so if the wax frame is already there and the comb is already drawn out and all they have to do is put honey in it, you're going to get a lot more honey. And so it's important to try and preserve as much of that comb as you can. And so another thing that you can do is use a serrated uncapping knife dipped in hot water. We had, it looks kind of like a hair pick. And we had one of those, and you just slide those under and pop off the wax capping, that worked pretty well. It is a little bit labor intensive. So if you have a lot of hives to go through, I can see where the electric knife, with maybe more practice than my students, just kind of wielding them around, would make sense. So there's a lot. Do you place only 9 frames in a 10-frame honey super so the comb is deeper? I'm doing that this year. So what Tim is asking, we've been talking about 10 frames. And so when you have a honey super, what you can do is you can buy a spacer. And I actually just bought one. I'll have to take a picture of it so I can add it to my slide deck. But the spacer will evenly space your frames so that you can put 9 in there and there's more space in between. And so what that does is the bees will build the wax out further. And so your frames will have more honey in them. So you'll have less frames, but those frames will have less honey. And so, those frames will have more honey. And what it's doing is it's saving you wax. And so it's easier for the bees to build out further than it is to start a new frame. And it's also easier to uncap it if the honey is expanded beyond the wooden frame. And so Tim has a good point. A lot of beekeepers will put 9 frames in, use the spacer, so you don't have crazy weird things happening in your box, because bees will build comb in anything that's greater than 3/8 of an inch. And so you can get this weird, funny comb that's really hard to deal with. And so you want to use the spacer if you're going to do the 9-frame method. But yes, I'm actually going to try that this year and see. I showed that frame earlier. I did have some space between my frames. My frames are a little bit chunkier than normal, but it is an option. I think it's a good one to try if you have the patience to space them out. Okay. Oops, I lost my mouse. Okay, there's a lot of different extractors that you can use. For the online course, we have videos of us using many different kinds of extractors. There is a manual extractor, there's electric extractors. If you have any kind of physical issues with running a crank, electric one would be a better option for you. When it comes to physical constraints and beekeeping, I will mention that a lot of this equipment is heavy. So once you have a deep box with all of the frames and all of the honey and baby bees and everything in it, that's about 50 to 60 pounds. And so kind of be mindful. There are some different styles of beekeeping equipment in terms of a Langstroth hive goes up. There are some different kinds of hives that go horizontally that are a little bit more user-friendly for someone who has mobility issues. And so do a little bit of research before you just go with the standard Langstroth if you have some issues with lifting and things like that. So again, there's the manual extractor. Obviously, the manual extractors are cheaper. The electric extractors are a little bit more expensive. There's also something called the crush and strain method, which is where you actually just scrape off all of the wax. You put it in cheesecloth, you crush it, and then you strain the wax, or you strain the honey through. That is just buckets and time. But the issue with that is now you've lost all of your wax for next year. Some people do it, so I do mention it. If you join a beekeeping club, a lot of times they will have extractors that you can sign up to borrow. I will mention everyone needs the extractors at about the same time. So keep that in mind. If your plan is to borrow the club's extractor, everyone's going to kind of need it. So just something to keep in mind. If you have a freezer that you can store your frames in and maybe harvest kind of off season, that might be a good option for you. Okay, step 5, strain honey into a bottling bucket. Allow honey to rest for an hour. The bottling buckets, I have other resources that will go into more detail in terms of like how to actually create a bottling bucket. I created mine from the food safe. Make sure it says food safe. Buckets from Tractor Supply. You can buy what's called a honey gate that actually just like opens and lets the honey through. And so you drill a hole in the bucket as far down to the bottom as you can. You install the honey gates, and then you fill that bucket with honey. Typically, you let that honey sit so that the bubbles rise to the top. So you have that really nice, clear honey when you go to bottle it. I was nervous because I made these buckets myself. And so I actually kept the buckets in a tote, a very clean tote, so that if it did leak everywhere, I could just scrape the honey out of the tote. Like I made sure everything was clean, the outside of the bucket, everything before I let it sit because I was worried about it leaking. So really kind of thinking this stuff through the first time you do it to make sure that you don't have some hiccups. The buckets, especially if you store them in your attic, will become brittle. I saw many pictures of very sad beekeepers with full buckets, 5-gallon buckets, where the handle broke off, and then they have honey all over their garage. So keep that in mind. Label the containers in compliance with Oklahoma laws. So honey labeling laws. It applies if you have produced less than 500 gallons of honey within the year. This is a weird way to phrase it. This is how I know the lawmakers either were a very smart beekeeper or we're not used to beekeeping, because you sell honey by weight, not by fluid ounce. And so when they said 500 gallons of honey is probably about 700 pounds. So keep that in the back of your mind. That's a lot of honey. That's a lot of honey. Off of 2 hives last year, one did really well, one did okay, and I got 45 pounds. So it's a lot of hives. Your hives have to be located within the state of Oklahoma, and your honey is raw and has not been altered with other products. The second you infuse your honey with chilies or berries or anything else, it becomes an adulterated product. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing to do, but there's just a different list of rules. Now you're kind of more into like the jerky making, bread baking, cottage laws. Right now, raw honey is just an agricultural product. Okay, so the containers must have the common food product's name, net weight of the honey, the beekeeper's name, phone number, and address of where it was produced, and the statement, bottled or packaged in a facility not inspected by the Oklahoma Department of Health. The labels, there's a lot of online options. I got my labels from I just Googled like bee jar labels and made some like off the shelf kind of cutesy label and put it on there with this information. You do have to have your address. So it needs to be the location where your bees are. I know some people are kind of nervous about that. To be honest, property records are open access in the state of Oklahoma. And so if somebody really wanted to figure out where you lived, they could do it. I think, don't come at me if this is wrong, but if you are really, really concerned about it, if you had your phone number and like the town you lived in, I don't think people would have a problem with it, but the official rule is that it has to be the address of where the honey is produced. For the statement, I actually got return address labels from Walmart and printed that statement on it and just put it at like the bottom of the jar or at the very top of the jar. Because that's a lot of text to try and add on one of those like pre-made honey labels. And remember, it is the weight of the honey, not the fluid ounces. And so like if you buy like an 8-ounce mason jar, you will not be filling it to the top. Does that make sense to everyone? Because 8 fluid ounces of honey is really like 9 to 10 ounces. And the weight will vary depending on the moisture level of the honey, like what the honey's made of. And so like you're actually have to weigh. So what I did is I weighed 1 jar and then saw where it was on the jar and filled the rest of them up to that level. Okay. Cosmetic labeling laws. So there are a lot of people that make other products with the wax. And so like you can make lotion bars, you can make lip balms. This is a great way once you're more established and have extra wax to make some additional money. And so on the principal display panel, you have to have the name of the product, identification of the products and its intended use, warning label for misintended use, net quantity of ingredients, You also have to have a panel printed directly on the product, which includes directions for safe use, warnings, name and address of the business, and a list of ingredients ordered by prominence. Okay, so here is what the enterprise budget looks like on the Excel sheet. And so what you can do is you can type in your own numbers. And if you actually know the pounds, like if you weigh your frames, you can type in how much they weighed. If you don't really know, it will give you an estimate. So it can give you like a projected harvest. So if you're trying to figure out like, do I want to do bees? Can I make enough money? You can do some projections using this Excel sheet as well. Your startup costs are actually from the very first fact sheet that we talked about. So you just put that number up there in the right corner. And then you go through this and follow the directions, and it has really clear information. So Tim has a great question. I did realize about 30 seconds ago, I did not talk about moisture level. So moisture level, technically, you do not need a refractometer, because if you only harvest capped honey, any honey that is capped, because the bees come with a built-in refractometer, if they cap it, it has the correct moisture level. Done. However, if you harvest frames that are like half capped and there's like corners that are uncapped, you can take a refractometer, which is a moisture measuring piece of equipment. They're not expensive. I think they're like 20 bucks. In the beekeeping video, I actually use a refractometer and I show you how to use it and show what the settings are. Don't hold me to it. I think it's 0.8 is the correct moisture level. And so if you think about it this way, if you know that the capped honey is correct or below the moisture level that you're targeting, if you have a little bit of uncapped honey, it's probably fine. If you have a lot of uncapped honey, that's when you really need to start using a refractometer and make sure that you're at the correct moisture level. If you have too much moisture in your honey, it will not keep. It can go bad. Honey at the correct moisture level that the bees determine and cap will not go bad. There was honey that was found in ancient Egyptian tombs that is still good. It's not moldy, it's not nasty. And so that moisture level piece is really important. It is also important to realize that if it is a very humid day when you're harvesting, if you leave that honey sit out, it can draw moisture. And so you want to make sure that like you are keeping track of the moisture level with that refractometer. If you have any kind of concern, or if it's a wet day, or really try and harvest when it's not a moist, wet day, you have a little bit of time there. If you know it's raining, don't harvest. Does that answer your question, Tim? Okay, great. Thanks for catching that, because I realized as I was talking about this that I needed to circle back. Perfect. Okay, so we have your different options of things that you can purchase. There's, like we talked about, different levels of extractor and uncapping knife, uncapping scratcher, all these different things. So I have example prices. You can put your numbers in. What you may notice down here at the bottom is it will actually calculate for you your annual ownership cost. And what annual ownership costs, the way to think about it is, do you really expect, well, we already told you you're not harvesting your first year, so you have no revenue coming in. But most of the time, like our equipment that lasts a long time, like the boxes, our beekeeping suits, like all of those things that last, a honey box typically lasts 10 years. Like a wooden box that's painted well and like well maintained lasts about 10 years. So there's not really an expectation that you would pay all of that equipment off your very first year. And so what annual ownership cost is, it is spread out over the life of that piece of equipment, what the actual cost is in terms of that year's cost over the life of the equipment. It's not helpful if you have bills to pay, but it kind of helps you keep in mind what you're doing. So it will calculate your annual ownership cost, and then it will calculate your break-even price of honey. And then you can also, there's two different tabs. There's 1 pound and then there's 8 ounces. And so depending on the size of jar you want to use, you can use either tab. You can run some numbers based on the prices from last year. I think my student found that the 8-ounce jars were actually more profitable, which was kind of interesting. But anyways, so you can play around with that and put in different prices and figure out what your revenue would be depending on the size that you have of jar. Pricing, there's not really, you can't really collude, right? Like you're technically not supposed to like go on Facebook and ask all the beekeepers what they're charging. But if you go to the farmer's market and you see other people's prices, or you know the prices from last year, you can kind of go from there. I felt like my price was really high this year. I live in Stillwater. Let me preface that. I really wanted to just give away a bunch of honey for Christmas gifts and other things. And so when people asked me to buy it, I did 8-ounce jars and I charged $15 a jar and I sold out. So that is what the Stillwater market supported last year. It may be different in your area, so just keep that in mind. Okay. So this is just an example one. For example, it was assumed that you had a 10-frame medium Langstroth box that was harvested, totaling 40 pounds of honey. These are just zoomed in versions of what I just showed you. So go through that. All right. Farmers market considerations. Farmers markets, they all have their own rules. And so you really have to call the farmers market. We do have a fact sheet, FAPSI 184, that does cover some general farmers market rules. It also has contact information for the farmers markets that were cooperative. So if they answered my poor grad student calling them for the 15th time, then they got put in the fact sheet. So I do have some numbers. Also think about liability insurance. So there's something called FLIP. It is particularly for food products. And so even though you're selling a product that's a natural product, it is honey. If somebody were to ever say like, you didn't use a refractometer and now your honey is moldy and I ate moldy honey and I'm allergic to mold and I had this reaction, having liability insurance is just always something that's good to have. And we do mention it in our fact sheet, different options about the liability insurance. Taxes. If you are selling your honey off of your farm or at the farmer's market or a roadside stand equivalent, you don't have to collect tax. We are talking about raw honey. The second you infuse it with chilies, the second you put berries in it or do something else, you have to start doing tax. Same thing with like lotion bars and lip balms and things like that, that's taxed. So the only tax-free thing is the raw honey from your farm or the farmer's market or a roadside stand equivalent. If you have more questions about taxes, JC Hobbs, your man. Okay. Any questions? You can ask me about anything. It doesn't have to be like the finance stuff. Okay. Just so I know, like, how many of you guys have bees already? You can do like you can do a thumbs up if you have bees or like a wave or something. Okay, bees in a greenhouse. I would not put bees in a greenhouse. Bees can travel up to 5 miles and they typically travel 2 miles and they need a lot of resources. And so what you have in your greenhouse is not enough to support a beehive. You can leave the door open and let them like go in and do their thing, but I would not put them in the greenhouse. I've also heard stories that they just hit their little bodies against the glass. So that's gross. So we have some hives. Oh, I didn't mention this, but it is recommended Again, I started with 1 hive and I survived, so I'm not saying like that is a bad thing. You should typically start with 2 hives. There's a couple reasons for that. 1, you can compare them against each other. 2, if you end up with a queenless hive, you can put brood and eggs in the queenless hive and try and let them make their own queen. Me being in Stillwater and knowing the amount of aggressive bees in my area, I am no longer letting my hives requeen. I'm buying queens from here on out. I said that, and then I had one requeen themselves kind of without me knowing. I realized it later that they had requeened themselves and they're very gentle, so I'm just going to let that one go. But if I can have any control over it, I'm not letting them requeen themselves. It also is nice to share resources. And so like I had a hive last year that made a ton of honey. I gave a weaker hive some of that honey. And so having 2 hives is always recommended. You can get by with 1, especially if you have beekeeping friends in the area that are willing to share some resources if they have them and you need it. In terms of particular type of bees, you will read a lot. You will read people's things that say, so Olivia Toothman is a county educator as well, and she heard that Russian bees were aggressive, and I read that they were not aggressive. And so we both bought Russian bees for very different reasons. And I don't know, we couldn't really tell a difference. They were more expensive. And so I don't think either one of us are going to do those bees again. What I would say is, especially if you're getting a nuke, which is a really good thing to do, whatever is local to you. And so a lot of local beekeepers tend to have Italian and Cornelian or some kind of mix of that. And so whatever is doing really well for the beekeepers in your area, like don't try and fix what's not broken and just buy nukes from local people and go with that. Weed barrier on the hive, how far should this extend? So mine extends about 4 feet past my hive in all directions. So again, I have a fenced off half of my yard that is the side of my house. There's a raised bed garden. The bees are back there. There's a gate because I don't want my dogs back there. And so I went about 4 feet out. I wish I would have tripled up on the weed barrier. So keep that in mind. I do mow back there and they don't tend to get really mad. I did get fiber internet recently, and I had to lend the fiber internet guys some bee suits because they had to drill underneath the beehives for the fiber internet because that was apparently the only way to do it. And they had mentioned to me that whatever frequency their equipment made bees very angry. And so they said that they had bees like come and attack them that they didn't even know where they were coming from. And so like those guys just suited up and did the fiber internet. So also keep that in mind when you are deciding where to put your beehive. Make sure it's not in a spot that you need to get to a lot. Because if you do have a problem with an aggressive hive, like I've heard of some people that try and put them with chickens, which I've heard there's some benefits to doing that, but having a really aggressive hive last year, if I had to go out and feed chickens every day and be around that hive, it would have been really bad. Okay. Do you not think the VSH behavior is an integral part of the integrated mite management? VSH behavior. Can someone clarify that one a little bit? Oh, yes. Yes, the Varroa mite hygiene. Yes, sorry. It's like 8 o'clock. That is why I have students that are adamant about spraying with the sugar water. So that encourages grooming and helps with the Varroa mites. And then there also are some bees that are being bred to be more hygienic. Again, I do think having a nuke and having a good local supply is a little bit better than going a few states over and getting something that you think is bred differently. So people have different opinions on it, but if you're getting a nuke, it has to be within driving distance. So unfortunately in Oklahoma, that kind of limits us. Like I know like Cornell and some other universities are doing really cool stuff with their genetics, but we just don't have a local supplier. Could we start in the early fall if we buy a nuke with some honey reserves? No, the fall is too late. So everyone hopes for a really long honey flow. So you'll hear people say honey flow. And people have all these predictions, and they'll be like, the sumac's blooming, the honey flow is upon us. It's like farmer's almanac, like moonbeam stuff. But the fall is too late because if we don't get rain, there will not be anything. And they really need all summer. So there's a saying, I think it goes like a swarm in July, a swarm in June is worth a silver spoon. A swarm in July is worth something else. And then it goes downhill from there. I should really look it up. But basically anything that is starting past June is really too late, even if you feed a lot. And people won't have nukes. There's a really short window for nukes because the way you make a nuke is you split a hive. And so they're not available at all times of the year, if that makes sense. Tim is just really hitting it hard with the good questions and comments tonight. If you do this with a family, I recommend having an EpiPen on hand just in case. I have an EpiPen at my house. It's expired. EpiPens are really expensive and hard to get if you don't have a prescription. But if you know someone who needs one, typically their insurance will pay for a non-expired one. And so having an expired EpiPen is better than nothing. Again, I know I'm being recorded. I'm not telling you to use an expired EpiPen. Please don't sue me. But I just telling you what I have at my house. I have an expired EpiPen in a drawer. I also have Benadryl on hand. I have English setters. They're a bird dog and they eat bees. And the first few times they're stung, they swell up really bad. And luckily my dogs have developed a resistance. And so they can get stung a whole bunch now before they swell up. But at first I had Benadryl on hand and gave them Benadryl. So keep in mind your pets and livestock and other animals. Horses, I've heard of horses kicking hives and kicking hives over or bucking and kind of kicking a hive. So just keep that in mind if you're starting to like combine enterprises. Anything else? Bugs do go up and die. I think we've hit a lot of the FAQ. If you think of something later, you can always email me. Like I said, we're working through a lot of these commonly asked questions and building out the fact sheets and materials. A lot of the really detailed things like the hive inspection, exactly how to harvest honey, how to use a lot of this equipment, that will be videos that will be available on the online course. So we also have an in-person, to plug all the stuff, we have an in-person beekeeping workshop. I will not be there, but there will be a few other speakers. I'm sorry, I had to pop up. I'm pulling up my calendar to give you the exact date. There is a beekeeping workshop at Oklahoma County on July 26th. So that's a great opportunity. And then there will be one in Tulsa, September 7th. That one will be particularly good because we actually have a extension beekeeping person coming from Arkansas to talk about a little bit more advanced topics. And so that would be a good one. Tim has another question. Does powdered sugar sprinkled on bees help with varroa mite infestation? Olivia Toothman, the county educator, that is what she uses. That is the method that she uses. I will say that if you are to the point where you're seeing the crinkled wing disease, like I was seeing, there was a lot of mites. There was no amount of powdered sugar that was knocking back those mites. She does use it. It is very time consuming. So I know you mentioned you have one hive, so that would potentially be an option for you, for people with multiple hives, because you have to do the powdered sugar. There's a powdered sugar protocol, in case people aren't familiar with this, where you actually sprinkle powdered sugar down your bees and encourages grooming. It knocks off the mites. The issue with it is because the mites live in the brood, you have to do it so many consecutive days in a row. And so it is not a one and done thing. It is a program, right? And so if you have 10 hives and you have to do this over the course of, I think it's like 10 days, that's a lot of work. And so, and especially if you have a lot of mites, then that can be a problem. I will say the school hives, there's 10 of them. They have never been treated for mites.
Wow.
So some hives just don't have mites. Olivia has not had a huge mite problem with her bees either. Knock on wood. She has struggled a lot with waxworms. I told her I've never even seen a waxworm. I left a box full of drawn out comb uncovered for 2 hours. So I had stored this wax. I had put it in the freezer to kill anything in the comb, put it in the box, double bagged it with trash bags facing opposite directions, put rubber bands around it, and stored it over the winter. I went in there because I needed one frame, opened it up. All the frames were fine. Took my frame of beautiful wax that was drawn out, put it in the hive, did some other chores. I needed my husband to help me rebox everything because it's kind of hard to get in the bags. And in the 2 hours that it was uncovered, I guess moths got in it. And because it was in my garage and it was dark and there's moths everywhere right now. And so 2 days later, I went to get more frames out and it was just covered. And the moths were everywhere and it was disgusting. And I had to scrape all that wax off and throw it away. And now the frames are back in my freezer, killing any of the eggs of the waxworm. And so I should have knocked on wood harder because I told Olivia, I've never even seen a waxworm. And then the next thing I know, I had 10 frames completely destroyed. So you never know. I will say there's some talk about putting hives in shade versus full sun. I have a friend who is 2 miles away. His hives are in shade most of the day, and he's yet to have honey. And he's on his 4th year. There's no reason we're 2 miles away. So it has to be the fact that mine are in direct sun and his are in the shade. I have no other explanation. Some people say if you put them underneath trees, or if you put wood chips underneath them, you get more hive beetles. Again, if your colonies are really strong, they can take care of the hive beetles themselves. So you'll hear a lot of conflicting information. I think it really is kind of a case by case basis on like what your environment can support. Okay. Anything else? And like I said, we'll have multiple workshops and they won't all be exactly the same. So I would say, and both the in-person workshops are going to be like $25 because we provide lunch. So those are great opportunities. And then of course the online course.
Thank you, Dr. Burr.
Of course.
If this is your first time attending, these are always recorded and it will be available later if you need to go back, because I know that was a lot of really helpful information and you can go back and reference it later. If you need to get a hold of Dr. Burr, you can go to the OSU website or you can call any of your local extension offices. And we apologize for all the different Zoom links. There will be another Zoom link sent out for the next one, and that will be the final one, hopefully, for the rest of the series.
And Lauren, you're going to share the fact sheets, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
and those go into a lot more detail too. So
yes. There's not any more questions. I think we'll go ahead and end for the night. Thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you next month.
thanks.